Welcome to Way Back When, Big Blend Radio's history podcast. So, everyone, we're back here with photographer, cinematographer, showrunner Jeff Reed, talking about the National Parks USA that premieres on National Geographic September 8th. So, if you're listening today, it's airing tomorrow. So, you got to go keep up with that and go look up on all the channels. All those links are in the episode notes. Today, we're going to talk about the cultural connection and the human connection of the parks featured in this amazing series. Again, we've got Zion National Park, Katmai National Park, Yellowstone, Everglades, and Olympic National Parks all featured in them. And I think what's great about this, Jack, is that you guys have focused in on the indigenous people that lived in these parks and telling their stories. And so you've really brought a then and now to this part of it, bringing in some of the families now today and finding them and being able to share their story, which is pretty special.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we went in there with that idea consciously. We wanted to tell the stories of the national parks, to have these love letters to the national parks, but not necessarily to the political organization of the national park, as an
Mhm.
established place, really the land, the wildlife, the culture's there. And so
Mhm.
part of that, for far more history than has been Euro-American history, has been indigenous history. So, there were people that loved Yellowstone for 10,000 years before we, were calling it Yellowstone, and before we settlers moved in. And before there was really necessarily a need for the
Mm.
national parks as well.
Yeah.
And so we wanted to make sure that we incorporated some of that at least. We
Mm.
could do an entire mini series about that topic, but at least to touch it on. These are primarily wildlife shows, but we want to make sure we paid some attribution to the people who've been there.
Well, what I thought was also brilliant is that you showed the coexistence. I think let's go to the Everglades again because we want to. And so
Mhm.
the Everglades, we look at what Marjorie Stoneman Douglas did as a conservationist, and that's also modern history now, right?
Yeah.
That was the other thing. You've got the indigenous people, but then you've also got scientists like Griggs out in Katmai
Mhm.
and explorers on these expeditions. So a little bit of then and now with that. But I think what was great was I think it was is it Betty Osceola that was out there in the Everglades talking about her people of today. And so they show this coexistence. And so it's kind of this Marjorie Stoneman Douglas did one thing. I know she didn't like being in bugs. I remember even reading her talk about that. Like, I do not want to be around bugs. I'm not into it. But people lived within the bugs and still do. And so that I thought was really special. So when you talk about nature and wildlife, this cultural connection, this is a coexistence that we can learn from, I believe, when we step in the parks. Right before we were recording, Nancy came in, she says, I just wish we'd watched some of these, what you've done with this series before we go to the parks, because you
Mhm.
have a bigger set of eyes when you go in from the work you've done.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge thing to know that when you're going into places like the Everglades. And yeah, like Marjorie, she respected the area. She
Mhm.
valued it intrinsically for its wildlife, for its plants. She didn't necessarily want to be out in it. And so she brought that kind of Euro-American mentality to it of pushing against nature. And the people who lived there before her were, I think, pushing against it in their own way. They certainly found their own sorts of insect repellent. They found their
Yeah.
they lived in harmony with it though, because it was their land, and it was where they hunted, and they traveled, they moved along. They were for a long time, nomadic in there, and would travel down where the good fishing was and back north during the winter. And um yeah, I think each person that has ever been in these places, I think, has felt some sort of connection to them. There's a reason people lived in the area that's the Everglades for so long, and there's a reason Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, who was she was worldly, but she hadn't been, she wasn't like an extreme outdoors person. She wasn't driven to get out there and be uncomfortable, but she saw the value in this place existing untouched.
Mm,
And so I think that's where her vision, our vision, and the vision of Indigenous people like Betty, align, is this idea that nature, if we just let it be, often it's okay.
yeah.
I think there's some corrections that are underway, especially in places like the Everglades, to make sure that it's trying, it's able to coexist with places like Miami on the periphery, and
Yeah.
to try to mitigate invasive species and these things that will damage the park. But I think so. There's a few different ways of looking at it, and yeah, we could learn something from everyone. But the one thing we wanted to get across was that people have been stepping foot onto this land forever and using it, falling in love with it, respecting it, and that's kind of what we want to get to, no matter where you are.
Mm. I don't think we've been to a park where you don't have history connected. I mean, even Gettysburg has, a huge part of the area where you go through the battlefields and we're like, okay, now if we it's overwhelming, the history is really brutal there. But
Mhm.
then you go in this pastoral areas and there's woodpeckers and cardinals and everything. We're just sitting there going, look at that. That's a big woodpecker. And they're massive out there. So you kind of have this thing and you understand you have to go back to what people we're living with, and it wasn't I mean, the Europeans coming over started exploiting. I mean, and we all everyone's had a little bit of a story of exploitation, but I think the indigenous people of these areas really understood how to work with the what landscape they were in and to treasure it and to connect. So like Zion, I thought with the night skies, how that connects to today and how they
Mhm.
were going, this has been part of their people, just the stars, the stories that come from the stars, right? So that was something special too. And you also again showed parks after dark, which is really an important thing too.
Mhm. Yeah, and I loved Autumn's story as well, who is our dark sky ranger in Zion, and she technically worked for the Pipe Springs National Monument,
Oh wow.
and which is on the periphery of Zion, but
Mm-hmm.
her ancestors, the Southern Paiute, is also that ancestral Puebloan who would have been in and around Zion, and it's a unique park in the sense that there was the Virgin River Valley, which I think was productive and a good farmland, good for agriculture, good for hunting,
Mm-hmm.
for indigenous peoples for a long time. But then there's also an aspect of beauty that I don't think there was much reason to be up in certain parts of Zion, like the Narrows, where there's evidence that there were people, other
Mm-hmm.
than to enjoy it. I could be wrong. There could be some resource gathering, but there was, I think there were people driven in that area to just go in there to look at it and to be in awe
Wow.
of Zion forever. And the same with the stars, the same with that with Autumn. The stars hold the stories. It's something they took with them when they were forcibly removed from the area that's
Mm-hmm.
Zion and moved around, and so they could still keep those star stories. And I think that's one reason that the stories have persisted over the last few centuries,
Mm-hmm.
where they may have been lost with a lot of their other culture, and so that's an important part that she helps carry on. It's a part of you know this idea of the stars that we all grow up with, and American and Western society, often we grow up with the stories of Orion and Greek and Roman
Mm-hmm.
myths and the stars, and we don't ever really think twice about, do other people have analogous stories? And of course they do.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Yeah,
that, and so, yeah, Autumn was able to share some of those with
that was
us.
really cool. And the I know Olympic National Park too. I mean, that history on that coastline. I mean, that's incredible history. I mean, that even ties into even Lewis and Clark coming through that way. It's like when you think
Mhm.
about the tribes on the coastlands where it's really beautiful, but that's some hardcore terrain for them to live in. That was the other part of, Yellowstone is beautiful, right? And
Mhm.
gorgeous. And, you're in the wildlife part, you're saying come in the winter. And then I'm thinking, well, how did they live out there back then? It's like you've got to
Yeah.
think about all these indigenous people, how they really had to acclimate. I mean, I'd be a total like I have the snow photo from Yosemite in the background because I'm melting in New Orleans. So like, but what can they do there. I mean, they really had to adapt and learn a way of life. And I think that was great to see in Yellowstone and then also Olympic National Park to learn more about their stories and
Yeah,
the
yeah. I
people.
mean, totally. Yeah, these places were, you forget how much we've removed ourselves from being in tune with the land, with this ability to understand the weather, understand animal movement, understand anything just based on living out there. We, as filmmakers, get this tiny glimpse of, we start to learn the behaviors of animals, and we start to learn kind of the characteristics of a land over a year or so of working out there and spending a good amount of time. And that's a fraction of a time that somebody who was living subsistence off the same land would have done, and they would have had generations of knowledge passed down.
Hmm.
So I think they had just this connection. It was hard, but they understood the what was coming their way later in the year, how they were going to make it through hard times, how to adapt, and use the land in that situation. And so it's I think like, yes, we focus on the preservation of these lands as national parks as well, but they would focus on how to preserve and use it.
Yeah.
And so these places provided resources. Olympic, you mentioned, was, the salmon were the backbone of diet
Mm,
there. And one of the first things that happened with industrialization is we dammed up those rivers, right?
mm-hmm.
And it took decades and decades for those dams to come down, and that was a monumental achievement, to bring the El Dam down, for instance.
There's
And
still a fight going up even in Northern California, and there's
yeah,
changes being made all the way up, I believe, right now, which is
mhm.
good. We need to make those changes. I just wonder if they're going to ever unleash Hoover Dam. So,
Yeah, right.
or
Yeah, that one
Colorado
will be a
River. It's
tough
not
one.
salmon, but
And
yeah, I'm just like the
yeah,
Colorado River is like we still have all those sensitivities, right, for all of that. So it's kind of like, but our native peoples really understood water and filtration and all of that. And then you think when you go to some of our national parks, you see where settlers came in, dry farming, even just south of you in Yellowstone, up
mhm,
in that corner by Colorado, there was a lot of dry farmers in
mhm.
just like northeast Colorado is rough. How did they do this?
Yeah, yeah.
And so it's like, wow. So that's part of, I love that you brought that part into these stories, but the other part is that you brought in this wonderful history of the then and now of scientists like and conservationists. So Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, and then also going to Robert Griggs in Katmai. That is an incredibly fascinating, crazy, cool story of him. Just didn't really quite know everything until you got out there because he was kind of like, "Hey, I'll go out there and see an explosion." Like it
Yeah,
was
yeah.
the way back, what, 1915? I can't remember the date 100%.
1912 would have been the
19,
eruption, and then yeah, 1915, yeah, the
yeah.
the the expedition, yeah. And
Wow.
he was funny. I like him because he was kind of this like classic fake it till you make it guy. In
Yeah.
some ways, I think he was a sharp guy and a sharp botanist and had a mind for science. He wasn't a geologist, and so he
Mm-mm.
missed the cues on some of that I think, he didn't bring a geologist along on most of his expeditions, and kind of took it onto himself as a hobby in some ways. And I may be giving him less credit than he deserves, but he yeah, he misread the volcanoes. And to be fair, that's a unique landscape. It's a unique volcano. But I think a trained volcanologist, which was a rare thing at the time, or a trained geologist would have recognized what he did not a little bit faster, which was the fact that Mount Katmai, this famous mountain that became the center of the park and collapsed during the eruption, was not the actual volcano that erupted. Instead, it was a neighboring smaller volcano called Nova Erupta, 6 miles away.
Mm.
And you can understand where they look up and they see this Mount Katmai, and then they have an eruption, and then Mount Katmai looks like a volcano with a big crater in it, caldera in it, and steaming. And of course, that's the natural way to think about it. And but no, it took them, there were hints and people making hypotheses about what actually happened, but it took several decades for scientists to go in and actually prove that it wasn't Mount Katmai that erupted. It was Nova Erupta. It was the
Mm.
biggest eruption of the 20th century. It was unique in the way that he erupted, the type of rock that he erupted under. And so this is incredibly hard, kind of silica based material that is now 500, 600 feet deep in the
Mm,
Valley of 10,000 Smokes. And
wow.
this it created this amazing landscape. And yeah, you referenced it. The story, that was the catalyst to make this a national park, to protect it as a national
Right.
monument first. It was Robert Griggs and his team going there over several years, from 1915 to 1920 or so. And you
That's
know,
not easy doing that either. Can we just
it's
go back then? I mean, it's not like, I mean, going to Alaska, you've been there, right? And you've been to where
yeah.
he was, right? And it's not exactly a quick, easy drive over there.
Yeah, it's not. And I think, back then, I'm trying to look at it through the eyes of history. And he wrote in his book that it was easier to access than Yellowstone for him.
Wow.
And which was an interesting perspective. And he might have been using hyperbole to try to get it, to compete with Yellowstone, which he seemed to have a grudge against to some extent. He said, this is the next Yellowstone. It's far easier to get to. And I think it was because they could get to the coast by ship and they didn't have to do a huge cross country voyage. Um,
Okay.
and that's speculating there. And I guess, that's assuming you start on the West Coast, but yeah, they were porting pretty close to Katmai, and then they hiked over this hill. And I guess he had this grand vision of just building a road up into there.
Wow.
And he had the theory that Yellowstone, which was being degraded at the time by tourism and people kind of throwing stuff and bathing and bottling water and all these things that happened at the hot springs there. He had this idea that Yellowstone was going to cool off and die, and Valley of 10,000 Smokes would never cool down and was eternal. And this was like
Yeah.
a primordial Yellowstone, a birthplace of geysers, and didn't really realize it was just magma steaming, the last remaining water burning off underground, and the steam 30 years later was pretty much done. There's a couple little steam pockets left, and that's about it.
That's so interesting because, then you go to Yellowstone and you've got your indigenous people who know what's going on, and they
Yeah.
always follow the path of water. And, he was talking about one guide, he was talking about the obsidian, which is
Yeah.
insanely cool. I saw that in Oregon, outside of south of Bend, Newberry. I think it's a Newberry National Monument, and it's like this crater, and then got a national forest out there. And we found this hike of obsidian, and it's like literally boulders of obsidian everywhere. It's it's weird, man. It's like it
Yeah.
looks like licorice. You actually want to eat it. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's like, and we were getting snowed on with all these black boulders, and it was just like, oh, this is kind of like what's going on where you are in that area, I suppose, back then, those explosions and the obsidian. So,
Mhm.
when we talk about history, all those things must, I mean, it must have been so fascinating as the indigenous people watching what was going on. So that is
Mhm.
very spiritual and deep, and those stories go through from there and go through down. And here we bring in science, but then I think the two have to meet, you know. And I think you
Mhm.
did that too, is bring
Yeah.
in the history, like you're talking about the salmon. That's the
Mhm.
same thing as this history of how things were. And, science, if science was allowed to be heard, maybe that wouldn't have been dammed up. Just saying.
Right. Yeah, I totally agree. And, Shane Doyle, who you referenced in Yellowstone, who
Mm.
is an archaeologist and just kind of he's kind of a just this huge source of wisdom and knowledge about specifically his tribe, the Otsalica Crow, and Yellowstone in general and the history there. And Obsidian Cliff was so fascinating because it's directly tied to the creation of Yellowstone. It's directly tied to the volcanism there. It's a beautiful rock, and
Wow, it's crazy.
it has this incredible history with indigenous peoples that have been, they were some of the first hard stone miners in the area. They were mining obsidian and shipping it, and
Wow.
it's kind of for me as and it was an entry point into remembering that native tribes were far more cosmopolitan than we were taught to believe, and was intentional, to kind of make them an other. But it, you know, there were highways, there were trade
The
routes,
royal
they were,
roads. I
yeah.
mean, yeah, if you even go
Yeah.
think about the royal roads and all these historic trails,
Hmm.
the migratory tribes, it's amazing because of Canada, got
Hmm.
Alaska, Canada, and then going all the way down Mexico. And people were migrating for all kinds of reasons, very nomadic. Some just kind of disappeared from a
Yeah.
region. And, and they traded. And so, like, Mexican Indians, they would
Hmm.
all trade. Like, you find macaw feathers in Chaco Canyon.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
like, what do you mean?
Mm.
Yeah. It's like, yeah, we'll find
And
shark teeth in the desert too.
exactly. Yeah. And Yellowstone obsidian has like
Wow.
a lot of rock has a chemical signature that they can track. And so if there's obsidian found elsewhere in the country, elsewhere in the world, they can say this is where it came from. So
Wow.
they found Yellowstone obsidian from coast to coast, basically. It's all the way the Hopi Mountains in Ohio, I think, in the Midwest are, there are huge deposits of, I think, hundreds of pounds of Yellowstone obsidian that was moved across. And so it has to be pretty valuable to move hundreds of pounds of rock across the country. And so what Shane was referencing in that pretty short segment was that, well, yeah, so let's use the rivers, let's use things that make it a little bit easier to do that. And so the river being right next to Obsidian Cliff was perfect for them,
Wow.
and they'd move it
It,
out and ship it, and it
that
was great.
geology is crazy because you're not looking at the black on the outside by it, but it looks like devil's postpile in a way. Like that kind
Hmm.
of, it's just, it looks like beef. I don't know how to explain it.
Yeah, yeah, it's a
It's
special, it's an attractive place, and and you can't get very far up there. There's hundreds of yards of these big obsidian cliffs, and I think you can find these big ditches where they've mined it out, and there's plenty still there, and you're not allowed to take it anymore, so it's protected.
no,
But
that's the
it's
most important thing is that it's
yeah,
protected.
yeah, and
Yeah.
it's great to see it. And if you look down on the ground, you see little fragments of it everywhere, and it's just fun to pick those
Wow.
up, look through them, drop them down where you picked them up.
Hmm.
But you can definitely see the remnants of that. And then around Yellowstone, the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, where obsidian isn't natural, if you're finding it, it's often that it was brought there by
Wow.
indigenous people, and napped there or used, and so there's a lot of archaeological evidence of it throughout.
Yeah, this is just great stuff. So when are you going to do that new series?
We need to get started. We need Nat
I
Geo. We need
know.
this one to rate well.
Oh,
We need
listen,
people to
everyone,
watch
I
it.
don't know what needs to happen, but vote nicely, give good reviews, right? Reviews, people can do reviews on this,
Yeah.
go be nice. We want more. That's all I can say is we want more. 63 national parks, so you got five in, you got a lot to do.
Yep.
So,
And I should add that we're really proud of the fact that Michael Spears got to narrate this,
yeah,
and
he's got a
he's
great voice, man.
indigenous guy here in Bozeman, from the Lakota in South Dakota, and he's just was special to have in the booth, and I think gave this a voice that is not typical in natural history stuff,
Mhm.
and I think will add a little bit more to the series, and we were excited to have him
Adds
on.
balance. He adds balance
Yeah,
because he's got good timing. It's just kind of that very strong but not over powerful and just makes you want to sit down and listen.
yeah,
It's this natural storyteller. But I have to
yeah,
Nancy and I were both saying it was just the way you tied all the stories together between nature and human, and geology, all of that, the way it was woven together was really, really smart. You
thank you.
guys all like really sat like, okay, well, we can segue to this and that. I was like, segue. This is fantastic. I love it. I love it. But thank you so much for what you've done, everyone. Again, go get it on National Geographic, September 8th. It's out
Thanks,
there.
Stacy.
So thanks so much, Jeff.
Thanks.
Thank you for joining us here on Big Blend Radio's Way Back When History Podcast. Keep up with us at bigblendradio.com.